evening. Welcome to the Boston Public Library's Local and Family History Lecture Series. As part of our program, we want to read the following statement to bring attention to the land which we use for our building and events. We acknowledge that the Boston Public Library's Central Library stands on land that was once a water-based ecosystem, providing sustenance for the indigenous Massachusetts people, and is a place which has long served as a site of meeting and exchange among nations. We are committed to land acknowledgements for all locations at which we operate. We reaffirm this commitment to set the context for our planning, deliberations, and public engagement, which will take place from the spirit of welcome and respect found in our motto, Free to All. Tonight, we are very pleased to have Bill Lichtenstein here to talk about his book, WBCN and the American Revolution, How a Radio Station Defined Politics, Counterculture, and Rock and Roll. Bill Lichtenstein is a journalist and documentary producer, winner of more than 60 major journalism awards. He has written for publications including the New York Times, The Nation, The Village Voice, and the Boston Globe, and produced and directed the feature-length documentary WBCN and the American Revolution. He worked at WBCN from 1971 to 1977, beginning as a teenage volunteer on the station's listener line. This program is being recorded. Please mute your electronic devices. Questions will be taken at the end of the lecture, and copies of the books will be available for signing and sale after the program. Thanks for coming and enjoy the lecture.
Thanks. Hi. Thank you all for coming out tonight. How many of you are at the library for the first time, the Boston Public Library? And how about, how many of you were BCN listeners at some point? There we go. I haven't been in this library for so long. My earliest recollection of this new wing of the library is right after they built it. I remember coming here as a young child and walking down through the book stacks, and it was my first existentialist crisis, because some kids look up at the millions of stars and think about all the galaxies out there they'll never see. And I just remember looking at all the books thinking, if I started reading now, there's no way I would ever get through all these books. It was very humbling, and this has always been an important place to me, so I was really thrilled to be asked to speak here. I want to thank Diane and the library for putting this together. You know, one thing about this project was it was much more than about a radio station or one city, or it really was a much broader story that we tried to tell. And in some ways, things have changed even since we finished it. A friend of mine was remarked that he and his wife, who had met at the radio station back in the day, now have grandchildren, and a 4-year-old asked him how he and his child's grandmother met. And he said, I met her at this radio station we both worked at. And his grandson said, what's a radio station? And he started to say, well, it's radio. And then he realized, you know, radio didn't mean anything to him because he listens to Spotify and he gets the Red Sox game on TuneIn. And so, you know, a lot of things have changed, but there's some central points, I think, about the book and the film that remain important, and I think it's part of what the appeal of it has been. What I wanted to do is talk about me and how I made the film and got involved with the station and about the station, and leave lots of time for questions and discussion afterwards. I'm sure you all have questions. In some ways, I've joked that this film was, and book, as you may know, it's a documentary film and then a companion book, were 50 years in the making, because when I started working at the station at the age of 14, which I'll explain, it was clear that there were just historic things going on, and I began even at that age, the way many of us did during that period, to keep little scraps of things. A lot of people from that era will remember, you know, keeping a Life magazine cover or political button or a ticket stub, and a lot of it ended up, you know, under our beds or in our parents' basements, or, you know, but that stuff we kept just because it just seemed to be important. And at the station, I would keep little bits of audio or things that just seemed like they were timely in a way that it wasn't quite clear then. But I got involved with radio because I grew up just loving radio, and like many kids of that generation, would go to bed at night with a small transistor radio under my pillow, and would listen sometimes to 12, 1, 2 in the morning, and under the pillow, so my parents wouldn't know that I was not asleep or listening to the radio. And on AM radio, you could get at night when the AM radio wave bounces off the ionosphere, and at night, as the ionosphere goes up, there's bigger bounces. And so in Boston, you could often pick up, and the cheaper the radio, the better, less discerning. You could pick up Chicago, New York stations, stations from down south. And it was just an opening to the world to hear people from other cities, advertisements, music. I was really just transfixed by the idea of radio. And in ninth grade, I was going to junior high school in Newton, in town of Newton, and city of Newton, and I was in this alternative educational program called Tri-School, and one of the things they asked us to do every Wednesday was to go out and get a volunteer job. And around that time was the fall of 1970. This radio station, about a year and a half before it had gone on the air, that people were talking about, that didn't sound like anything else on the radio. It was on the FM band, which was new in those days, and it was largely for FM was allowed you to broadcast in stereo, which AM wasn't, and also it didn't have static, and so initially it was perfect for classical music, and then the station came along and started to play rock and roll, and it just didn't sound like any other kind of radio. It was conversational, you'd hear all kinds of music, and it was the station WBCN. And so I called the station to ask if I could volunteer there, and the luck was that they had just decided to bring volunteers in to answer the phones. What was happening was listeners were calling the station with questions, everything from my roommate's taking too much LSD, what should I do, to I just got a draft notice, do I have to respond to it, you know, a pizza place that's open after midnight, I need a ride to San Francisco. And the person on the air, while they were trying to do their show, was the person answering the phone. So there was this constant sort of balancing act of trying to be a radio announcer and play music, but also attend to people who were calling in many cases with very serious, you know, important questions, and sometimes just a request. But the station was sort of positioning itself as a station that really was interested in what people had to say, and so the idea of answering the phones was important. So Charles Aquadera, who is a central figure at the station, probably the most celebrated of the announcers over the years there, got the idea to bring volunteers in to answer what they called the listener line. And it was a special number they gave out. It was the Google of its era. You were told, if you have a question about anything, either we'll get you the answer or we'll try to help you find the answer. And volunteers were brought in to answer the listener line. And so I called on a night when they were trying to figure out how to fill the schedule in November of 1970 to offer my services to volunteer. And they said, yeah, come on in. And the person who hires me to this day swears I told her I was 16. I was 14, but I started working there, and there were a lot of kids who were my age, a little bit older, that were going in and you know, helping out and answering the phones, and so I started answering the listener line, and then shortly thereafter, a guy named Danny Schechter became known as the news dissector, or was the newscaster on BCN, and became sort of an important figure in Boston and also nationally in journalism. Had been hired. He was doing 3 newscasts a day by himself without any help. And so one day, as I was finishing up my shift on the phone, he said, do me a favor. And he gave me his Sony cassette recorder. I don't know if you remember them, with the piano keys on the end. And he said, there's a protest up the street. We were at 312 Stewart Street then, down by Park Square. And the main Boston police station was just up the street on Berkeley Street. He said, there's a demonstration going on at the police station over the shooting and murder of this Black Panther in Chicago, Fred Hampton. The police said that they showed up to arrest them and they were fired on and fired back. The Black Panthers are saying that this was a setup and that they went in and basically murdered him. And so take the tape recorder, push the red button, and he gave me the perfect question for a 14-year-old who had never done an interview before, but he said, push the red button, hold up the tape recorder, and ask people, why are you here? Which was, the perfect question. So I got a lot of material, came back, he said, anything good? I said, well, this one guy was really interesting. And he showed me how to edit tape, and I began cutting tape together. First the interviews, then began to do stories, and then began to do these little montages that became kind of a signature sound of the station involving bits of actuality, Nixon, or politicians, and music and comedy, and began to produce these segments. And in the midst of it, I was called in not long thereafter by Norm Weiner, who was the program director, who said, if we gave you 4 hours a week of airtime, what would you do with it? Because really at BCN, when you had a shift, there was a lot of albums played, records played, but it was your 4 hours. You could do what you wanted. You could bring somebody on to perform. You could read, poetry. And so, my idea was to create sort of these soundscapes of material, and I ended up with a weekly show, Saturday nights, all night. I give my parents tremendous credit for tolerating it, although they always knew where I was. They could turn on the radio. And was there until 74, and then summers through 78 while I was in college. And, it was a very heady time. There was a lot going on. It seemed like there were times there was something going on every day politically, and many changes going on socially and culturally. I ended up going to Columbia Journalism, ended up working at ABC News as an investigative reporter for a number of years. And by the 2000s, in the midst of, I started my own company, and in the midst of the aftermath, excuse me, of Iraq and 9/11, excuse me one sec. There was a period when there was a lot of discussion, I think it was around the 2004 election, about why there was not more public dissent and opposition to what was going on with Bush, with the Iraq War. The thing I remember most that sort of made me think about it was Bruce Springsteen had done a benefit concert for John Kerry, who was the Democrat running against, I guess Bush was the Republican then. And people were accusing Springsteen of being too political for doing this benefit. And I was thinking, in our day, if you were doing a benefit for the Democratic candidates, you would be accused of being too conservative. And so I started thinking about, what was different about BCN, that so much of the music, the culture, the radio, the media, all this stuff was sort of funneled into very targeted opposition on virtually every major issue: the war, women's rights, gay and lesbian rights, racial equality, the environment. All these issues were sort of highly targeted, and it just didn't seem to be happening. And so my first thought was to do a documentary about, there was a folk singer. Are you all familiar with Phil Oakes? Was a folk singer around the time of Dylan's ascent. He was became popular as well, but his songs and lyrics were much more, while Dylan is very mysterious and mystical and poetic, Oakes was almost like reading the New York Times. He did songs about the Cuban Missile Crisis or about the draft, and was very clear what he was talking about. And initially, the idea was to do biography of Phil Oakes to show how an artist can use their craft to make a difference. And his family was split. We were working with his sister, Sonny Oakes, his brother, Michael Oakes, who also controlled the world's largest archive of rock and roll memorabilia and photographs, had a very different idea of what he wanted the film to be. And he eventually went out and they hired a guy named Ken Bowser, who did this thing for American Masters. It was very sort of predictable, and not the film I would have wanted to make, but we weren't able to do that. But around the same time, a couple of things happened. One was I began to see on the internet, this is before Facebook, and in fact, I remember that clearly because when I first discussed the idea of doing a film about a radio station for which there were no tapes in the archives. The station was still on the air, but they had no recordings from this period, and there were no archives of photographs. I mean, there was nothing. And somebody said to me, how are you going to get, like, photos? And I said, well, people, can share them, what they have over the internet. And they were like, how do you share a picture on the internet? And this was before Facebook. This was really at the beginning of all this sort of media sharing. Napster was just launched, and if you went on Napster, you could hear all this music, a lot of which had been lost to the ages. So that was one thing, and I was able to hear a lot of music that was important to BCN in its early days that I'd forgotten about, and get copies of the songs. And then there were two other things that happened. One was in 1973. Bruce Springsteen, who had been hugely successful on the New Jersey Shore as a bar band, had started going to New York, first solo with his guitar and then with his band, to try to break in New York. And at the same time, he was coming up to Boston. And he spent pretty much a good year just playing dive bars in Boston, Joe's Place, and the one by Fenway Park is still there. Just really crummy bars in a lot of cases. And in the midst of it, he came up to WBCN with his band, with a tuba, and played live on the air. And I remember driving around, at that point I was driving, 73, so I was about 17, and turning on the radio, and there was this, like, amazing music. And the last song they played, they were on for about a half hour, with Max Sand, who was the announcer, was Blinded by the Light, which was his first sort of breakthrough song. And it was just amazing. It was a song really made for a group of people all singing together, in the background, whatever. And so I went to the station and asked Max Sand where the tape was, and put it on, and realized that we used to tape on these big reels moving very fast, so it was high quality, but on a big reel, 10-inch reel, at 15, most of them go at 7, like at home if you have, or ones at school with the smaller reels, go 7 turns a minute. This was 15, so it was double the speed. It was only a half-hour recording time per reel. And Blinded by the Light started, and then about 30 seconds into it, the tape ran out. And I was just heartbroken, gone to the ages. And then something happened that had never happened either before or after that anybody I know was aware of, and that was the tape disappeared. I mean, BCN was a place where nobody ever stole records. Nobody ever took any. I mean, it was just, there was a sense of reverence for what was there. The tape disappeared, and out of Max Sand's, personal, we each had a little sort of personal box to put our stuff in, and it was gone. And for decades, I used to think about that interview, that tape, and suddenly in 2005, I see Bruce Springsteen live on WBCN on the internet. And so I download it, somebody just put it up, and sure enough, after 31 minutes, it runs out. So I know that is actually, it's not somebody recorded it off the air, that is the tape. And I downloaded it. And the other thing I found was the day that Dan Ellsberg turned himself in for leaking the Pentagon Papers, which revealed sort of the great lie that underlay Vietnam. I was at the courthouse, federal courthouse, with Danny Schechter, who, as I remember, was like right next to Ellsberg with a mic in his face, and I was about 20 feet off to the side. And I found this photo from the New York Times. There's Ellsberg, there's Danny with the microphone. And so I started to think that maybe out there is stuff that we could use to make a documentary. This is well before the word crowd was used in any context. In fact, we called it open source, an open source documentary. And if you go to Wikipedia and you Google open source, it will say the first open source documentary was this film where we basically put the word out starting in 2006. If you have any tapes, if you have any photos, if you have anything, please lend them to us for this film. And almost immediately, this guy called up with all these cassettes. Cassettes had just started it was a new technology in 1970. And people were thrilled with it because on a little tape, a little audio cassette, you could record 90 minutes or 2 hours worth of music. And so people would record off the air and carefully, document what was on it. And so we began getting all these tapes. And at the same time, there were a number of photographers in Boston who had shot, tremendous amount of stuff during that period. So they would, give us access to their photos. And so I started thinking about what a film about BCN would be. And I remember calling Charles Laquadera up, who at that point was in Hawaii. He retired. And I said, I'm thinking of making a documentary about the station. And his first response was, who cares about like a 30-year-old radio station? And then he said, although I'll tell you something, he said, I don't think a day has gone by since then that somebody hasn't said to me, that thing you said, that thing you played, it changed my life. And when he said that, I realized there really was something there. To this day, I have not been able to fully wrap my brain around what there is about the station that has engendered such enormous love and enduring, passion by people. I have a sense of it. A lot of people, it was the first time they heard a particular kind of music, or, they link it to important moments in their life. But really, I would say outside, the only other cultural phenomenon that's no longer around from 50 years ago that people just melt, when you say the name, I think it's maybe the Brooklyn Dodgers. And other than that, there's this, BCN response when you mention it to people that just, it still amazes me. And I think for those of us who were there, we didn't have a complete idea of the impact we were having, as was going on. There was a nightly ritual where, particularly on the weekends, they would read all the clubs in town, big, small, and all the bands who were playing. So you could have like a high school band playing at a restaurant, and you would get mentioned on BCN. So to us, it was just logical. You'd want to, make music that's going on around Boston available to people. But talking to people who were in bands who were mentioned on the radio, it was a huge deal. And so, we began collecting, material for the documentary. One of the things about the station, I think, that really, set it apart, and one of the major things that changed in terms of radio was, and Tommy Hadges says it in the film, and I think also in the book, is that these were people who were seeing radio not as a performance, but as a relationship with their listeners. And it's so common now when you turn on WGBH, NPR, radio stations, we're interested in what our listeners think, write us and tell us, In those days, it just didn't happen. Radio was about performance. It was, Guy Lombardo on New Year's Eve and Top 40 Radio, which was largely people sort of screaming and loud commercials to get an audience to sell commercial time. And the same 30 songs over and over again every week. There were not a lot of opportunities to have a relationship with listeners. BCN was all about the relationship between the station and listeners, and that was really new. And I think that's what really, in a lot of ways, set it apart and changed kind of the face of radio. And so the process of making the film was, I've been calling it archival verite, in the sense that cinema verite, you don't have a script. You go out, as you may know, and you just shoot. And you shoot and you shoot, and then you see what you have, and you sort of make a story out of it. Most historical documentaries are done with the story first. So Ken Burns will say, Lincoln arrived in Washington on this date and was surprised to find, the door to the White House was locked, or whatever. And so we need a photo of Lincoln at a train station, and you go find the images that will fit with what you want to say. We didn't know what we wanted to say. What we knew is we wanted to find the best archival material we could, whether it be audio, visual, stories to some extent. And then when we would find one thing, we would go look for more. So I've equated it with kind of archaeology, where you're digging and digging, you find the toe of a dinosaur, you go, there must be other foot bones around here someplace. So it was like that. So we would find a tape of Patti Smith in this broadcast from, it was her first radio broadcast, in which she was told, don't swear on the radio, and of course she went off and they let it go. And we had the audio of that. There must be photos of that. We found the night that Bruce Springsteen played at the Harvard Square Theater and opened for Bonnie Raitt, that John Landau, who was writing for the Real Paper at that point, said, I've seen Rock and Roll Future. Columbia took that review, put it everywhere, Columbia Records, and it's sort of what propelled him to stardom. Well, we found a tape of that, and then I found somebody who had photographed it, and then a second photographer, and so we put that together to create these sort of archival moments where you can see it, hear it. And then once we had begun to build those, we had a sense of, what the story would be. So, for example, WBCN started in the back room of this club, the Boston Tea Party. There were hundreds of bands that played there. The ones we focused on were the ones where we could get the audio and get the photos, and then we would ask people about them in the interviews. And so the structuring of the film was happening on three levels. There was the station and its history. There was what was going on in Boston and sort of, what it was set against. And then there was a layer of what was going on nationally. And in that, Nixon became the antagonist of the film, because Nixon was really what this was all about anyway. BCN went from being, a station playing cool music and trying to be hip to a much more political, iconoclastic, almost subversive, revolutionary media outlet because of the draft, because of Nixon. And so he became, the antagonist in this. There was a line, I think I thought it was Ralph Gleason, but it wasn't, who started Rolling Stone. But in the book, I finally figured out what the line was. But it was haunting me initially because I had heard it and didn't know where it came from. And the line was, it didn't matter back in the day if you were studying for a test, if you were shopping for groceries, if you were making love to your partner, somewhere in the back of your mind you were thinking, we've got to get rid of Nixon. And it just had a very, and hauntingly, during that period, there were a lot of people who felt that way about, Trump. It was that saying, the people who were not Trump supporters had that kind of focus, we've got to just do whatever we can to get rid of. But Nixon was 8 years, or I guess 7 years, 6.5, 7 years, and really, it sort of dominated. And so it was almost a singular focus on him and his policies that kind of overshadowed the whole thing. So that became kind of the uber narrative for the film. Among the other, we did this very, very broad archival search. Among the places we found material, interestingly, the Boston Public Library has an amazing collection of news footage going back to the 70s, 60s, 50s, I think. It's all on film, so it's really hard to work with. You have to get it transferred. And they were tremendously helpful. The opening of the film, for those of you who've seen it, is a series of news reports and stories surrounding the arrival of the hippies on the Boston Common in 68, a year after the Summer of Love in San Francisco, and the opposition of the city to the arrival of the hippies. All that footage came from upstairs here, and we're just indebted to them for that. It was just, as soon as we saw it, it was like, we have to start the film with this material. It in a filmic sense, I mean, just to, for those of you who are filmmakers or interested in how films are put together, the structure of the opening of the film actually was sort of thought up by an editor we had who had worked on and edited How to Survive a Plague, which was the film about the AIDS activist group ACT UP in New York. And that began with these activists getting ready for a demonstration at City Hall, the police coming back and forth, the police getting ready for them, they start marching, the police start coming out, and then they clash, and it's like boom, and that's how the film starts. He had borrowed that from the beginning of Sunday Bloody Sunday. We have the IRA, you have the British military police, going towards each other, and then there's like this incendiary point. And so that is, I wouldn't say it's an homage, but that sort of structure of two competing groups and bang to start a film was sort of borrowed from that. And really, I think it opened up from the biggest obstacle we had was people presuming they knew what the film would be when he said it's a film about a radio station. So, okay, talk about the groups you played. And so, the purpose of the opening was just to completely remove it from that and sort of, set the scene in a way that said this is going to be something much different and bigger than what you're probably expecting. The film, we had a Boston premiere at the Boston Film Festival, which was great. A lot of people from the station who were still around came, and we were able to be up on stage right before COVID hit. It was like really fortunate that we were able to do that. And then we had a number of theaters that were going to play it, and they all closed down. So we both released it online, but we also contacted community radio stations across the country, which are rung below NPR stations. There's NPR stations which do good, but they're in a position to pay a lot of money to NPR for programming, and they run All Things Considered. Below that, there are community radio stations that have very little money. A lot of them are low power, and they subsist really on donations from the community and really trying to do community service. And so we said to them, look, if you either can get a theater where we can show it, or else put it up online, and we can charge, we'll split the money with you. And so there were 20, 30 stations that were able to keep revenue going during that period when it was very tough because of the film. And I guess the last thing I just want to say, BCN, in that era, Al Perry, who was the general manager in the film, who was one of us, he was our age, but somehow took it upon himself to be the adult in the room. He was a salesperson, became general manager, and really understood, A, that he had to make sure there was enough money in the coffer every week to pay people, and B, he was the buffer between the station and the FCC or people who were involved in ownership who, might not be as radical as we were. And he stayed in radio, and he would say that it was his belief that when the FCC first chartered radio stations in 1934, there was no organization of radio. Ships, probably the most important purpose of radio is for ships to contact each other and shore, and then there were commercial stations, but there was no order to it. And so they created the FCC in 1934 and gave them the power to license radio stations. And immediately they realized if you had a license, it was like a ticket to print money because, you had a monopoly on a service that you could charge money for. So they carefully structured it at that time so that each station would serve their community. And I think the language in the original was something like, stations are licensed to serve the welfare and convenience, I think the word is, of their community. And it was always Al's belief that in the history of radio, the BCN probably was closest to what the vision of a radio station should be. It was a place where literally you could call up and say, my dog just ran out of my car on comment, and they would put you on the air because it was, it was seen as part of the service we had to the community. And I think in turn, part of the power of BCN, the owner of the station, which initially it was, if you've read the book, you've seen the film, it was initially a classical music chain, and this guy Ray Riepen saw the possibility of playing rock music and it took off. But the owner stayed on, Rich Hastings, and he had this almost psychotic idea that he wanted the radio station to be on the top of the Prudential Building. So in those days, the Prudential Building was the tallest building in New England. I've argued that the 50th floor of the Prudential Building, which is inside of the Skywalk, and after 9 at night, you had exclusive access to the Skywalk for your own purposes, had to be the most expensive per square real estate in New England. I just can't think of anything where you could charge more money than being like in the Skywalk and having that office space. So he moved us up to the top of the Prudential, which started the financial pressure that eventually sort of led BCN out of this era. But the one thing about being on the top of the Prudential was, and Danny Schechter made this point, was that, this was an underground radical subversive station that wasn't in the basement of some church someplace. It was on the top of the Prue building where all over Boston people used it to navigate, and everybody could see it. People knew it was there, and in a way gave voice to people. The people knew if they had a problem, they called the station, the station would likely do something to help them. And, that was a really rare kind of relationship between the media outlet and the city, and I think part of the reason that there's such, strong feelings about it that endure. I think that's what I have to say. I was going to play the trailer, the 3-minute trailer for those of you who haven't seen the film, or just to remind you, and then I'm happy to take, questions. So why don't we play the trailer? It's about 3 minutes long.
And now it's time for our revolutionary new experiment. This is WBCN in Boston.
I will tell you a story. There wasn't any radio station at all that played any of this kind of music. I'm on the next show, baby.
It was clearly ours. Older people didn't like it, didn't understand it.
Well, we were all hippies. We all had long hair.
With 240,000 students in Boston, the best chance I had to pay the rent on this thing was to play rock music.
For the first time, there was an outlet for music like this on the radio.
You hear some Muddy, you hear some Grateful Dead.
Jefferson Airplane, Steve Miller Band, Quicksilver Messenger Service, and Donovan, Jimi Hendrix.
Hello, Bruce Springsteen.
We're on the air?
Yeah, we're on the air.
Hey!
This is my very first time on radio, and I'll say hello to my mother who lives in California. Hi, Mom.
You were not going to hear this music anywhere except at WBCN.
He did not hire professional radio announcers. He hired kids.
I was a philosophy major with no career prospects.
Boston was in the grips of counterculture, students trying to find new ways of living, new ways of being.
This is a group of Mama Dupa Abba Dupa listening to WBCN-FM 104.1 in Boston.
The response from people was so great because we were sort of treating radio not as a performance, but as a relationship with our listeners.
In the news right now, police in Boston got released this morning to help an anti-war demonstration about 30 Vietnam veterans.
The Vietnam War hung over everything.
Boston was a battleground of ideas. Henry Kissinger taught at Harvard.
250,000 college students, most of whom by then had turned against the war.
Nixon was the personification of American evil.
The FBI came to the house one morning.
They came in, all of them had their guns drawn.
It was an autumn of chaos, huge marches.
The pigs are coming! The pigs are coming! The pigs are coming! We gotta release it!
We formed a radio consciousness that was further and further and further more political and more dangerous.
Women, disc jockeys, not just in the news department. It was like transformative.
giving a voice for the first time to out-open gay people on the radio.
I don't know which disc jockey it was, but when they said, this is the American Revolution, you know, and you felt that they meant it.
We were trying to create something that hadn't existed before.
It was the internet of its day.
Independence, having people make up their own minds as to what to play, what to say.
Stuff like that on the radio. Wow, amazing.
We had the real thing.
WBCN in Boston.
So questions, and I'll repeat the questions they want to have me repeat it, so it'll be on the tape as well, so everybody can hear. Questions? Somebody must have a question. Yes? Where can you see the film? It's going to be, WGBH is using it for Pledge Drive in June, so they're airing it like 5 times in the first week and a half in June. So if you check GBH's schedule, it will be on the air. It's also on Amazon and iTunes for like, I don't know, $2.99 or something. It's not expensive. But it'll be on the air, and also, and you can buy DVDs online as well. Sure. Yeah. Sure. So, which was after this period, in about 74, 75, and the film ends around 74 with Nixon's resignation, the end of the war, largely because that was sort of the end of that era. Most of those people left. The station owner eventually sold the station to a group of people who would go on to build Infinity Broadcasting, which became CBS Radio. They hired Howard Stern. It was that group. But they came in 78 or 9 and simply fired everybody, not realizing, you know, what the community would do in return. And there was an enormous response on the part of the community, not just to boycott the station, but there were benefit concerts and, you know, outcries from other stations, and eventually they ended up hiring everybody back. But there was a bona fide strike there, you know, for, I think it went on for several weeks, maybe longer. I wasn't in town then. It had been preceded by, they had put a union in, interestingly, just because it was a sense that they should have a union in 73. And it's in the book. One of the interesting things about the union was they affiliated with the United Electrical Workers, which was an old, very lefty, almost in the old days, communist labor union. And in negotiating the contract, John Scagliotti, who's in the film and says, open out gay people, he and his partner, who's since passed away, Andy Kopkine, who was a great writer, they were both on the air there. They were a gay couple, and they were involved in the labor negotiations. And as part of the contract, Andy asked if they could say in the contract, among the things you could not be fired for, that you could not be fired for sexual preference, or I forget the exact way they phrased it then. And the story goes that the management lawyer said, well, what does that mean? And Andy says, oh, that means you can't fire me because I'm gay. And everybody went, oh, that's a good idea. So they wrote it in, and it literally was the first time in a union contract ever that protection for, you know, gender preferences was codified and became sort of language that then went on to be used in other contracts. But the union contract initially was sort of a pro forma thing. It really became necessary when they fired everybody, and it was just a stupid lack of understanding of what they were, you know, dealing with the station. Who else? Yes. Sorry? I listen to the radio. I listen to the Emerson station, ERS, which is pretty good. I just got a Google, one of those talkie speakers where you can say, play Rolling Stones, play Beatles. But I find I'm not really listening to a wide variety of stuff. The thing about radio is that for, I think for people that did not grow up with radio, that are used to iTunes and, Spotify, and it broadens your horizons. I mean, you can listen to stuff. It's sort of like everything else, right? People watch the news they agree with, and if you're listening to the songs you like, it doesn't expand your horizons. And the thing about radio is you're listening to other people's, tastes and ideas of what's good music. And one of the things about BCN was it was intended to really expand, people's consciousness. So I try to find, different, GBH late at night. Eric Jackson was on BCN, still plays jazz late at night. He's terrific. And then I found this thing, radio, you get, I forget what it's called. It's a free app. It's the whole world, and you can zoom in on any place in the world, any country, and it will show you the radio stations and you can listen to them. And so that's really interesting because you can go to the Ukraine and listen to a station, or you can find all kinds of interesting things. Well, you can find, so, like, they're not all in English, but there are English-speaking stations all over the world. And some of them are rock stations playing, maybe in a foreign language, but they're playing really good music. And it's just, even around the country, it's interesting to see, what kinds of things are on. More and more, unfortunately, as you probably know, radio licenses are in the hands of fewer and fewer entities. So you've got like Clear Channel and iHeartRadio, and each one of them owns 1,000 stations, and they're all playing the same songs, the same, raps coming out of one office in Texas or wherever they're based. And so the whole idea of community radio has really gotten, lost. Do you listen to radio? XM. And what channels? Deep tracks. They're about the closest to a freeform station in Boston, although they're not really. I mean, freeform really is whoever's on there can play what they want to play, and if you get somebody who really knows music, it can be an exciting, thing. Sure. Yeah, well, when I talked to Norm about doing a show, he was like, "You're going to have to get your third-class license," and I actually started doing they needed people Sunday morning from like 6 to 8 on NBR. I did for like a couple months just to get used to being in front of a mic live on the air. And so it's the same studio. It's in the basement of that building. It's the exact same. It's the same studio. There were a number of BCN people who came from NBR. Joe Rogers, who was the first guy on BCN that filmed with him spinning the record. He was on NBR. Oedipus later, who became program director for like 30 years and pioneered punk rock and new wave music in America, really, came from NBR. He was doing it there. And there were some other people who had been on the air there. And then there's a guy, he's not on anymore, but there's a guy named Eli Polanski, who's been on forever, who does a show that's largely this kind of music. NBR tends to be more like strip programming, so there'll be 2 hours of Broadway shows, 2 hours of jazz, so you don't get the same kind of, mix over the course of the day. But, they've been around a long time. They do a good job with what they do. Yeah, no, if you put it on the on, you hear all different kinds. Yeah. And mostly students, so there's a turnover over time of who's on the air. Yes. Charles he moved from Hawaii to California, and he broadcasts almost nightly on Facebook. He's got this Facebook thing rigged up in his home, And every night he turns it on, and there's maybe 40 or 50 people, and he doesn't really do Dwayne, although he got banned on Facebook for like a month, so he's using Dwayne's page. For those of you who don't know, Charles Laquadera in the 80s created a character who was his alter ego, who could say and do all of the politically incorrect, sexist, right-wing, nonsensical things that he couldn't say for fun, named Dwayne Glasscock. And he had a lot, he was Dwayne Eagles Glasscock. And at one point, Dwayne Glasscock was so outraged that something to do with the ratings. I forget what set it off. But he went on the air and gave out the address of the radio ratings service and asked people to go take some feces and put it in a plastic bag and wrap it up good so the post guy doesn't get, and to send it. And apparently they got hundreds. And Charles recalls being called in and being told that Dwayne was being fired. And Charles said, but, you know, I'm Dwayne. Well, you can say, but Dwayne has to go. And then, of course, he came back. So he doesn't do Dwayne a lot, but on occasion. And he does hold court online almost each night. And a lot of Facebook posting. He's almost always there with maybe a couple hundred people. I mean, he's got about 5,000 followers, but there's usually a couple hundred people at any given time. Are you on Facebook? Yeah. Yes. Passed away, I think about 20 years ago. No, that came after. A lot of things came after this period. Glutton of a Muffin was a guy who they were making fun of astrology on the radio, and he called up and said, you know, it's a real thing, and he challenged them to have their charts done, a couple of them, and they were just like, oh my God, this is like uncanny. And so he began going on the air nightly with an astrology report, and then they needed a disclaimer for the end of it, and the line they came up with is, remember, it's a wise man who rules his stars and a fool who's guided by, wise man who's guided by his stars and a fool who's ruled by them, was their disclaimer. But no, Darryl was the nicest guy, really, really sweet guy. And unfortunately, he's no longer with us. Danny Schechter passed away in 2015. Al Perry just passed away a few months ago. There's a memorial actually coming up for him. So it's been, losing a number of people from that era. Oh, yeah. There's a whole chapter, or not chapter, section in the book. John Brody, who was an announcer, the story is, he said, look, I went to a friend of mine who was a travel agent and said, I've got like $300, where can I go, for a week? This is back in the 70s. And he sent him down to Jamaica. And he said the first day he was there, he stumbled onto this record store and met the guy and spent the whole day smoking weed with him and listening to reggae music, and just, he'd never heard reggae music, he just blew him away. And then the guy said, tomorrow night we're going to go see a movie, and they went to this theater that had no roof, and they're showing The Harder They Come, and this was a movie featuring Jimmy Cliff and most of the major reggae artists of that time. It was filmed in Jamaica, produced in Jamaica, and at this point reggae was unknown in America. It just was not something anybody had ever heard of. And so he came back and he called Larry Jackson at the Orson Welles Theater and said, you've got to book this film. And so they put it in there the first night, not so much, and then they kept talking it up on BCN and playing the album, which had The Harder They Come, and the Wailers weren't on it, but just the Maytals, everybody was on it. And then it started selling out, and next to Rocky Horror Picture Show, that run at the Orson Welles has the record. It was like 5 years. It just ran. It just, and that's what put reggae on the map. And one of the things about the film is you hear stories like that. You go, oh, is that real? And I found this article and a Rolling Stone that said like reggae music, Boston of all places, and it had the whole, story of it, and so that's really, what happened. But it was a chance, visit of his to Jamaica that sort of set the whole thing off. And then the Wailers came to Boston. It was their first, visit to the States, and they played Paul's Molly, did a live broadcast on BCN, which I was actually at. I think there's a picture of me and Bob Marley in the book. They had a live chicken in the dressing room, and they did two appearances at Paul's Mall on their way to sort of really taking off. Well, that's I don't know if they ever did when they made air. The story that I know of is that John Scagliotti, again, was in the film, was charged with doing an interview with them, and so he got this little production room, got the chairs arranged, the mics arranged. They came in, they started smoking, he's smoking, they're smoking, and he said the dope was so strong that he was like, he said he did what was clearly to him like the best interview he had ever done. Everybody was thrilled, they shake hands, they hug, they leave, and just as the door closes, he looks and realizes he forgot to put the tape on. And so he went running out into the hallway. He says, just as the elevator, Marley's going, bye! And so that interview never made air. They may have done another one, but just typical of what went on there. How are we doing on, we have time for a couple more questions? Anybody? Yes, in the back. Sorry. Oh. Great station. It's a great station. Albert O was there, I think, right? Or Chachi was doing the Beatles show on another station, I think, is there. They've had a number of BCN people also on the air there, but UMB, which is the... They do a Dylan Song of the Day? Yeah, no, UMB is a great... college radio is really where it's happening. Like ZBC, which is the BC station, is a great station, but I think they're like 10 watts, and if you're not in the immediate Chestnut Hill vicinity, it's hard to get. But really, college radio is the only thing in this town, I think, that has any sort of creativity and spunk to it. I think that was later. I think I've heard about that, but I wasn't there then. If it was, I just don't remember it. But I mean, I think there's somebody I've seen on Facebook who says I was the BCN witch, and yeah. One of the interesting things about Charles's show was the story is mornings in the original BCN construct were the least desirable airtime slot because people were up late and slept in the mornings, and especially students. It just wasn't a big time for radio. They didn't have the morning drive audience that they have now. Their stations have now. And so there was an announcer meeting in '72, and Dinah Vaporin was asked to do mornings in this announcers meeting, and she said, "Oh yeah, great, give the SHIT slot to the woman." And Charles said to her, "Dinah, you should be ashamed. There's no bad slot on this station. You should be proud." She said, "I'll do mornings." And then afterwards, recalls saying to Norm Weiner, the program director, "What did I just do?" And he started doing the show in the morning, which became the big mattress. That construct, which is now like literally on every station in the country, we have an announcer and some funny people in the background, and they take calls and pranks and contests, and all that stuff didn't exist before the Big Mattress. That was his idea, and he brought in people who came through there. Billy West, who became the voice of one of Ren and Stimpy, the cartoon characters. Eddie Gordetsky, who became the producer of Two and a Half Men. I mean, there were a lot of hugely talented writers who came through there and other people. But most significantly, probably, was a Boston University student named Howard Stern, who was listening to it while he was a student, and says that that show gave him the idea for what eventually became, his whole shtick. And so, Charles really sort of pioneered that morning bedlam that became sort of, morning radio. And he was really good at it. If you've never heard it, it's on, clips of it are on YouTube, and just, very funny stuff. He was very fast. A lot of calls, pranks, just funny stuff, and very political at the same time. So, yes. I'm looking at a couple different documentaries. One of the things we're doing actually is we're raising money for a scholarship in Danny Schechter's name at Columbia Journalism, which is what I'm doing in the immediate. And then there's a couple of other documentary projects, including one that was begun by a couple of graduate journalism students, one at BU and one in Northeastern, and I'm looking at working with them on. So I think another documentary, but something we can get done much faster than like 15 years. It wasn't the only thing I did during that period, but this took a long time, and I think, you have room for one of these in your life. It's been done. Make a great fiction film? Yeah, no, we've thought about that, or an HBO series. In a way, it almost has like a Mad Men kind of period piece with different characters, and the leap to that is pretty huge. We've talked to, producers and companies, and it's, it has to be more developed than just like, oh, it's a good idea. You really have to come in with an idea of who the characters would be and storylines, and I'm not good at fiction. I've never been able to sort of write fiction. I'm excited by like seeing to me, there's nothing more interesting than what's real, and you almost can't make this stuff up. But the idea of just creating something, out of your head is not my bailiwick. But I've talked to people over the years about it, and I wouldn't be surprised if at some point somebody said, can we develop this? But it's sort of a big leap to do. But I agree. I think there's a lot there you could, either for a film or for a series. It was a really important time. So much changed in such a short period of time. I mean, that's what I think people forget, is just, the idea that, like, women weren't on the radio. And not only weren't women on the radio, they were routinely told it's because their voices were annoying and they don't carry well on the radio, which in the film you'll, hear how that played out. The barriers that were knocked down in a very short period of time, the BCN, had a hand in, is pretty amazing. And I think that lesson is what was important to me, for people to see how change can take place and how media can help create change and what they can do, whatever your skill is, to help facilitate change. And with everything going on in the world right now, it's, I think, an important lesson. So anyway, anybody else? Last call? Yes, in the back. That was well after, probably, whoever was on noon, Ken Shelton, or did they play one song over and over at noon? That was after. Part of the problem was like where to end the film, and really it was such a logical endpoint. And then we thought, well, should we go and say what happened next in the epilogue? But the station went on to 2009, and eventually it was just closed down by CBS. Ratings weren't good, and they wanted that slot for another rock station to make room for a sports station on FM. And so, it was really sort of a decided end point in 74, and we sort of used that. Anybody else? Well, I will be around signing books if anybody wants to sign a book or answering more questions. And thank you all again, really, for coming out. Appreciate it.